Before we get into today's episode, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone listening around the world. It genuinely amazes me how far this show has reached. So a few shout outs this week to Jordan listening in Nottingham, Ellie in Leeds, Marcus tuning in from London, Ben in Newcastle, Tyler in New York and Aisha listening in Dubai. I've also seen messages come through from Lucas in Amsterdam, Hannah in Copenhagen, Chris in Sydney and Neve listening in from Cork, which is incredible. If you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, please let me know. I always love seeing how global this community is becoming. You can find us on all the socials, just look for What They Hide Pod. There's also an email address in the show notes if you want to contact us that way. And if you're enjoying the show, don't forget to follow, leave a review and share the episode. It really helps more people discover the podcast. Now, this is part 3 of a 3-part series. In part 1, we looked at how Jimmy Savile built a life that gave him access. In part 2, we explored the pattern and the silence that allowed it to continue. And in this final part, we confront the full reality. This episode contains discussion of sexual abuse, exploitation and institutional failure. Some themes may be distressing, particularly as they involve vulnerable individuals. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Alright, let's crack on with the show. It starts like any other program, scheduled, ordinary. Nothing about it suggests what's about to happen. Someone sits down, evening light fading outside, the television flickers on. Another night, another broadcast, because for decades there's been no reason to expect anything different. A presenter appears, calm, measured. The tone is different. Not entertainment, not music, something else. And then the name is spoken. Familiar, recognisable, a name people have trusted for years. A man associated with television, with charity, with public life. And at first, nothing changes, because that name has always meant the same thing. Until now. The language is careful, precise, because what's being said has never been said like this before. The programme begins to outline what has been uncovered, that over a period of decades, Jimmy Savile used his position, his access, and the trust placed in him to commit sexual offences against children, against teenagers and against adults in multiple locations. At first, it doesn't land. It can't, because the information doesn't match the image. The man people thought they knew doesn't align with what is being described. But then more is said, that this behaviour was not isolated, not a single allegation, but repeated across years, across institutions, in places people trusted, hospitals, television studios, care environments. The programme refers to findings that would later be confirmed in investigations by the Metropolitan Police Service and the NSPCC, documenting hundreds of victims across decades. And now it starts to settle, not all at once, but enough to realise this is real. A voice is heard, then another, different people, different places, describing the same pattern, the same structure, the same moments. And that's when it breaks. Because this is no longer a question, no longer a possibility. This is a reality being uncovered, in real time, on a screen, in a room where someone is realizing everything they thought they knew was incomplete. For decades, he was trusted, welcomed, given access, and that trust allowed him to move through places where people should have been safe, without being stopped. Because the truth isn't just what he did, it's how long it went on, and how no one stopped it. This is what they hide, hidden crimes in plain sight, and this is the moment everything changed. At first, it's just one voice, careful, measured, saying something that for years had never been said out loud. And for a moment, it stands alone. Then another, not connected, not coordinated, a different person, a different place, a different time, but describing something that feels uncomfortably familiar. And then a third, and this is where something changes, because now it's no longer isolated, it's no longer something that can be explained away. It's beginning to form a pattern. As more people begin to speak, the same details begin to appear, not identical but consistent, the same structure, the same use of position, the same environments, the same feeling of something being wrong, but not being understood at the time. Different ages, different backgrounds, people who never met, who never spoke to each other, who had no connection at all, and yet describing something that follows the same shape. And this is where it becomes difficult to process, because it doesn't stop. The voices keep coming. More accounts, more people, more moments, each one adding to something that is growing faster than anyone expected. The number is no longer small. It isn't something that can be dismissed. It isn't something that can be contained. It becomes hundreds, documented, recorded, confirmed for investigation. By now there is no doubt, no uncertainty, no room for interpretation. This is a pattern, repeated over years across different environments, in places where people should have been protected. Hospitals, television studios, institutions built on care, spaces where people were vulnerable, spaces where trust was assumed, and in each of those places, the same structure appears, again and again and again. And this is where it becomes overwhelming, because it's no longer about a single story. It's about many, layered, stacked, each one reinforcing the last, until the full picture becomes impossible to ignore. Because when this many voices say the same thing, across time, across place, across people who have never met, it stops being questioned. It becomes accepted as truth. For those hearing it, for the public, for the institutions involved, there is a moment of realization, not gradual, not distant, immediate, because the scale of it changes everything. The hardest part isn't just what happened, it's how many times, how many people, how many moments that were never connected, never understood until now. Because once the voices begin, they don't stop. And once they are heard together, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Next, the institutions that surrounded him, and what happens when they are finally forced to answer. By the time the scale becomes clear, the focus begins to shift. Because this is no longer just about one man. It's about where he was allowed to be, and who allowed him to be there. In 2013, investigations begin across the country. Police, charities, government bodies, all looking at the same question. How did this happen? A joint report by the Metropolitan Police Service and the NSPCC reveals the scale. Not speculation, not rumour, documented. Over 450 victims identified, some as young as children, the majority female, but not exclusively, spanning decades from the 1950s to the years just before his death. The offences were not confined to one place. They occurred across multiple institutions, including hospitals within the National Health Service and with environments connected to the BBC. Places where people were vulnerable, places where protection should have been guaranteed. Investigations across NHS hospitals revealed something deeply troubling. Savile had been given unrestricted access, keys, freedom to move through wards, including at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, where he had been allowed to operate without consistent supervision, without effective safeguarding. The BBC faced questions, serious questions, about what was known, what was reported, and what was not acted upon. Allegations had surfaced internally. That did not lead to formal investigation at the time. A culture where hierarchy and reputation carried weight, and where challenging someone like Savile was not straightforward. And this is where it becomes clear. This was not one failure. It was many, across different organisations, different systems, different people, all operating in environments built on trust, and all failing to connect what was happening. Moments where concerns were raised, but not escalated. Instances where behaviour was noticed, but not fully understood. Situations where action could have been taken, but wasn't, because the information never came together. As these details became public, the reaction changed. Shock turned into anger, confusion turned into outrage, because this was no longer about the unknown. This was about what could have been known. And the question becomes unavoidable. How does someone operate across hospitals, media organisations, public institutions for decades without being stopped? The answer is uncomfortable, because it isn't one reason. It's a combination of trust, of reputation, of access, of silence, all working together, creating a system where this could continue. Because by the time the investigations were complete, the truth was no longer hidden. It was documented, recorded, impossible to deny, and far larger than anyone had imagined. This wasn't just a crime, It was a failure at every level. And then it leaves the room. What began as a single broadcast doesn't stay contained. It moves from television to newspapers to radio to conversations happening everywhere. Because once the story is public, it can't be controlled anymore. Front pages, breaking news banners, the same name everywhere, the same question repeated again and again. How did this happen? And it happens fast, faster than anyone expected, because this isn't a slow investigation anymore. This is exposure, and exposure spreads. At first, people are trying to process it, trying to reconcile two versions of the same person, the man they thought they knew, and the man now being described, and for many, it doesn't make sense. But then something shifts, because the voices don't stop, the reports don't stop, the details don't stop, and the story becomes impossible to ignore. More accounts emerge, more people come forward, more details begin to surface, each one reinforcing the last, each one adding weight, until the story is no longer being questioned. It's being accepted. And this is the moment the image collapses. Not slowly, not quietly, but visibly. The reputation built over decades begins to fall apart, piece by piece. People begin to look back at interviews, at appearances, at moments that once felt normal and now feel different, uncomfortable, difficult to watch, because context changes everything. Statements are released, carefully worded, measured, from organisations trying to respond, trying to explain, trying to understand how this could have happened. The BBC faces scrutiny, serious scrutiny. Questions about what was known, what was reported, and what wasn't acted on, because the story is no longer just about Savile. It's about the systems around him. The story moves beyond the UK. International coverage, global headlines, because this isn't just a local scandal anymore. It's something much bigger. A case that raises questions about power, trust, and how easily both can be misused. And now the tone changes completely. This is no longer disbelief. This is anger, public anger, demanding answers, demanding accountability. Because for decades, the narrative had been controlled, managed, shaped. But now, there is no control, no way to contain it, no way to return to what it was before. And this is where it lands, not gradually, but all at once. That everything people believed was incomplete. That the story they had accepted was only part of the truth. Because once the story breaks, it doesn't stop. And once people begin to see it, they can't unsee it. Next, the people at the centre of it all, the ones who lived it, the ones who carried it for years, and what it means to finally be heard. Behind every number, there is a person, a life, a moment that didn't make sense at the time, but stayed. Because when we hear numbers, hundreds of victims, decades, multiple locations, it becomes something abstract, something difficult to fully feel. But this was never abstract. It was individual, personal, real. They came from different places, different backgrounds, different ages. Some were children, some were teenagers, some were adults in situations where they were already vulnerable, in hospitals, in care, in environments where they expected to be safe. For many, it began the same way. A familiar face, a voice they recognised, someone they had seen on television, someone they had no reason to fear. And then, a moment that didn't feel right, not fully understood at the time, but remembered. Because that's part of what makes this so difficult. It wasn't always immediately clear what had happened, why it felt wrong, why it stayed in their mind. Because the person at the centre of it didn't match the idea of someone dangerous. And so for many, nothing was said. Not because it didn't matter, but because it was hard to explain, hard to process, hard to challenge, especially when the person involved was trusted by everyone else. Years go by, in some cases decades. Lives continue, but those moments don't disappear. They stay, quietly, in the background. Because what happened didn't end in those rooms. It didn't stay in those corridors. It followed people into their lives, into their relationships, into the way they saw the world, into the way they trusted others. And then something changes. The story becomes public, the image breaks, and for the first time, there is space. Space to speak, space to be believed. And that takes something. Because speaking about something like this, years later, is not easy. It means revisiting something that was never fully understood, something that was never fully processed, and placing it into the open. But this time, they aren't alone. Because now, there are others. People with similar experiences, similar moments, similar memories. And when those voices come together, something changes. For the first time, there is recognition, not doubt, not dismissal, recognition that what they experienced was real and shared. And this is the part that matters most, because beyond the reports, beyond the investigations, beyond the headlines, this is about people who carried something for years without knowing if anyone would ever listen. Because the story of this case is not just about what was done, it's about who it was done to and what it meant long after. Next, we step back and ask the question that sits at the centre of everything. Could this have been stopped? By the time the truth was fully understood, it was already too late. The voices had been heard, the reports had been written, the numbers had been counted. Hundreds of people, across decades, across institutions, all connected to one man, Jimmy Savile. And then, when everything is laid out, when the full scale is visible, when there is no longer any doubt, one question remains. Not quietly, not in the background, but at the centre of everything. Could this have been stopped? Because there were moments, not one, many, moments where something felt wrong, moments where behaviour was noticed, moments where people hesitated, where someone thought, this isn't right. But those moments didn't become action. They didn't become reports. They didn't become intervention. Why? Was it uncertainty? Was it fear? Was it the absence of proof? Or was it something deeper? Something built into the system itself? Because he wasn't invisible. He was everywhere, on television, in hospitals, at events, in spaces that demanded trust. And that visibility created something powerful, a reputation that felt unquestionable, because people assumed if something was wrong, someone would have seen it, someone would have stopped it. But what happens when the institutions themselves are not built to see it, when systems rely on hierarchy, on deference, on the assumption that certain people don't need to be questioned, when concerns exist but never connect, when voices are heard but not elevated? This wasn't one failure, it was many, across the BBC, across the National Health Service, across environments built on care, built on trust, built on belief that people were safe. And yet, that trust was used, not to protect, but to allow. Because the most difficult truth in this story is not just what he did, it's that he didn't have to hide it. Not completely, not in the way people expect. He operated in plain sight, in spaces filled with people, in environments where others were present, and still, it continued. So what does that mean? What does it say about the systems that surrounded him, about the people within those systems, about the culture that allowed reputation to outweigh concern? Because if something like this can happen, not in secrecy, but in visibility, then what does that say about how we recognise danger? There was no single moment where everything failed. There was no single decision, no single person, just silence, repeated, sustained, allowed to continue, until it became something far larger than anyone could control. And now, we look back, with clarity, with evidence, with understanding, and everything feels obvious. The pattern, the access, the warning signs, all visible, all there, but only when seen together. Because this story is not just about one man, it's about what happens when trust goes unquestioned, when reputation replaces scrutiny, when systems fail, not loudly, but quietly, over time. Because the truth is, this didn't happen in darkness. It happened in light, in public, in places people believed were safe. And this is what makes it so difficult to accept. So we are left with questions, not simple ones, not comfortable ones, but necessary ones. Would it be stopped today? Would those moments be recognised? Would those voices be heard? Or would the same patterns still exist, still unnoticed, still dismissed? Because the most dangerous crimes are not the ones hidden away. They're the ones we fail to see, even when they are right in front of us. This is what they hide. Hidden crimes in plain sight. Thank you for listening. Next time, a man is found inside a locked bag in the centre of a city. No signs of forced entry, no clear struggle, no obvious explanation, just a body and a question that doesn't make sense. The bag is zipped, locked, placed in a way that feels deliberate, and the more investigators look at it, the less it adds up. How did he get inside? Was it an accident? Or something else entirely? Because every answer creates another question. And the truth, maybe even stranger than the mystery. That's next time on What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight.